Drake Interplanetary created the Cutlass Red to address the needs of the frontier, medical services, and emergency response teams across the verse. The ship was designed to offer a compact, versatile, and affordable medical vessel that could provide critical care and rapid evacuation in areas lacking established medical infrastructure. Its focus on utility and accessibility aligns with Drake's broader philosophy of producing rugged, multi-purpose ships for individuals and organizations operating in challenging and remote environments. Welcome back if you're a returning viewer to the channel, and welcome aboard if this is your first time here. This is ForgeCore Gaming, I'm your host Phoenix, and this is a review of the Cutlass Red. Now that we've read the brochure, let's dive into the nuts and bolts of what makes the Cutlass Red from Drake Interplanetary potentially the best ship under the $200 price point. In this video, I'm going to include a stat overview and discussion, a brief tour of the ship's internal layout, an overview of combat viability, as well as a discussion on ship handling and use cases. From there, we'll discuss our findings and determine whether or not the Cutlass Red is one for the fleet or one for the bin. Starting off with the stats, the Cutlass Red certainly makes a strong case for itself right off the start. Just a quick side note, if you're new to the channel, the only parts I swap out during these reviews are the guns, and I always switch them to attritions, so that we have a universal baseline from ship to ship regardless of size or class. A few commenters have mentioned that I should also swap out every other component for their top end counterparts, but I'm not going to do that since top end components aren't available to everyone right now, as they're gated behind difficult content. And that's not a statement to contested zones. I enjoy them, and I enjoy the fact that the best stuff in the game has to be earned. There are plenty of arguments for and against that notion, but that's not the focus of this video. Anyway, starting off with the damage, the Cutlass Red puts up a respectable amount of DPS at 2016, courtesy of 4 size 3 weapon hardpoints and a fairly adequate base level power supply. Just a quick note, the power distribution shown on the right is what I decided to use for this loadout. Removing or adding power pips to weapons does change the DPS, as what's shown here is sustained DPS, which means DPS over time, taking into account the recharge of weapons after their capacitors have been exhausted. Moving on to the shields, the stock configuration yields 5100 bubble HP, which isn't bad, nor is it great, but it's fairly appropriate for a ship this size and price. The max SCM speed is respectable at 215 meters per second, with a max nav speed of 1125 meters per second. The pitch, yaw, and roll rates are 47, 39, 135 degrees per second, which actually makes it more maneuverable than ships like the Guardian and F-8C. Of course, these numbers are just indicators and don't always tell the full story when practical application comes into play. The Cutlass Red also has 33,920 hull HP, which isn't bad. It has 12 SCU of cargo space, which makes it viable for small hauling contracts or carrying a decent amount of cargo should you procure some valuable goods while out doing contracts. With respect to dimensions, it comes in at 26.5 meters wide by 37.5 meters long, or 288 pineapples, by 11.5 meters high, making it larger than a Guardian but smaller than a Vanguard if you needed something to reference against. It also has 36 SCU of hydrogen fuel, putting it in a decent position in the current build of the game, as well as 1.8 SCU of quantum fuel, meaning it can jump decently far distances, but you might have to refuel for the return trip once the quantum fuel usage buffs that are currently in game return to normal rates. I don't generally get into claim times and expedition fees, but why not? The claim time of the Cutlass Red is 14 minutes and 59 seconds, while its expedition time is 5 minutes. And just another side note, to this point I've made comparisons to the Guardian and Vanguard series of ships for several metrics, which is not to say that the Cutty is comparable to them in build or purpose, it's just to give you a frame of reference for dimensions and performance. That's it, don't read too much into it. And now that we've reviewed these stats, let's take a look at the inside and see what really makes this ship shine. Starting off in the rear, we find ourselves in the ship's cargo hold, which again can store up to 12 SCU of cargo boxes on the ship grid, and I'm positive you could squeeze in a couple cheeky SCU if you had to, as currently cargo boxes don't damage ship interiors, and who knows if that'll eventually go back to normal. Alternatively, you could also fit a small ground vehicle such as a bike, which could be helpful if you needed to evac someone from a hot area of operation. Moving on, we find ourselves in the med bay of the ship, which hosts not one but two Tier 3 medical beds, which can serve as a respawn point or as a means to heal Cat 3 injuries, which is huge for a ship at this price point, as medical beds are easily one of the most sought after features in a ship, especially if we're talking about daily drivers now that 4.0 is here and a ton of content involves gameplay on foot. The medical bay is also flanked on either side by two EVA ports, which can be useful in dragging in bodies either planetside or in space. And finally, you'll find 2 out of the 4 crew bunks here as well. Progressing towards the forward of the ship, we find ourselves at another sort of hab area just behind the cockpit, complete with a fully equipped shower, toilet, sink room, which doesn't have any bearing in the game right now, but for those who plan a fleet with lasting power, this is definitely a feature to consider. Just adjacent to the bathroom, we can find an engineering terminal, as well as 2 additional bunks for the pilot and co-pilot. And finally, we have 4 gun racks capable of holding rifle-sized weapons. Just a note though, I did not find any working external storage bins for gear and supplies, nor did I find any working component compartments. Drop a comment if I missed them. Last but not least, we make our way into the cockpit, stopping first at the co-pilot seat, where we can do things such as manage power settings and enter a remote turret that commands an articulating spotlight. As of right now, this definitely is a novelty in most cases, as I can't imagine most players would justify bringing along another crew member just to move a light around without any additional duties. One thing to note here is that there are no missiles on the Cutlass Red, and it would have been a really cool addition if the co-pilot at least had control over a slew of Size 1 missiles, just so that they could maybe feel like they contribute a bit during a combat scenario. Bear in mind, I know this isn't a combat-oriented ship, but still, who doesn't enjoy shooting at things in a video game? Moving on to the pilot's seat, I was actually pleasantly surprised by how good the view is, despite the fact that some of it is blocked by vertical and horizontal struts. Even with those in place, you do have a good amount of obstruction-free real estate, including the space above you in case you need to get eyes on enemies or items of interest. This kind of layout would be particularly useful if you use things like the Tobii eye tracker and are able to quickly look up and around you without having to fumble around on the keyboard. The MFD layout also seems very sensible, with 3 full screens within your immediate eye line, as well as a sensible placement of the ship radar, which, on other ships, often seems like a bit of an afterthought and is typically just slapped into place wherever there's enough space. It is worth noting that this is one of the only Drake ships whose interior I actually like. Most other Drake ships I've been in seemed a bit too slapped together and, for lack of a better term, trashy. Maybe I've just been reconditioned after seeing Pyro Stations, but the interior of the Cutlass Red actually seems clean and 90% finished. Almost as though the ship's buyer ran out of money and opted out of finishing touches, but at least there aren't any half-broken MFDs laying around and wires hanging from the ceiling. Now, it wouldn't be a Forge Core ship review if we didn't do a test in Pirate Swarm, so I queued up a match in offline mode and I got to testing. Here's what I found. The Cutlass Red's ability to get on target was surprising, and its sustained DPS played a big role in being able to take out small targets quickly and effectively. At first I thought I was just imagining at how good this thing felt in combat, until I started paying note to the time. I may be mistaken, but I'm 90% certain that the Cutlass Red has, so far, been the fastest ship I've tested when it came to finishing waves. Now, it isn't all positive. One negative I found was that the Cuddy's hips are a little bit wider than the cockpit configuration leads you to believe. The cockpit is narrow, and it gives you the feeling that you're in a much smaller craft than you actually are. The result of this was kind of funny, as I ended up crashing into a ship I had just destroyed, which ended up totaling my Cuddy prematurely. And what's even funnier is that this happened twice. After the second time, however, I paid special mind to the fact that the Cuddy has some girth to it, so it wasn't a problem again after that. Another note worth mentioning is that, though the Cuddy has a decent sized health pool, it also has a large surface area on which to absorb shots. Coupled with the fact that my shield pool is relatively low, I found myself with red hull panels pretty often. Typically speaking, I was saved by the proverbial bell as one round ended and another started, as this is when enemies tend to drop the ship repair items. I was also painfully noticing the fact that I didn't have any missiles. If this was a PU, I wouldn't have cared so much, as I tend not to use them due to their high restocking fees, but this is Pirate Swarm, and I kinda generally look forward to using some free missiles. With that said, I was able to progress all the way to the Hammerhead round of Pirate Swarm, without that much of an issue. Corsair wasn't much of a problem once I set it as my target, as the Cutty is much more maneuverable than the Corsair, and I was able to strafe cut, doing my best to stay as close to it as possible. The Hammerhead, however, was a problem. I tried two different tactics when attacking the Hammerhead. The first was to stay at distance, giving only my smallest collisional cross-section to the Hammerhead, and continuously strafing in small circles so as to sort of cut the rotational capabilities of my enemy. This seemed to work to an extent, but the Hammerhead puts out enough damage that just catching the periodic full volley ended up having some serious consequences. My second tactic was to stay up close and personal to the Hammerhead, on the advice of some of my video commenters, and though this tactic might work for much smaller ships, it didn't really seem to work for me in the Cutlass. No matter where I positioned myself, part of my ship was within line of fire of at least one turret. Now with that said, I'm neither surprised nor disappointed in the fact that I couldn't solo a crewed Hammerhead. That feels appropriate. And I deem this test a full success on account of the fact that this ship is still under $200 and offers so much more than combat gameplay. After Pirate Swarm, I naturally took this down to Winter Circle to see how she flew in atmosphere and low altitudes. Here's what I found. While there's nothing crazy to report here, I was pleasantly surprised by the fact that this ship felt stable. It's no fighter when it comes to taking corners, but it certainly isn't incompetent at it either. It also felt very stable, staying just above the water's surface, and despite some drift in my HOTAS setup, don't worry, my VKBs will be here in 2 days, I was still able to maintain a pretty low distance to objects and surfaces without feeling at great risk of crashing. So kudos to Drake here, this ship actually feels nice to fly. So then, what are my conclusions? Honestly, I'm shocked at how much I like this ship. It's a Drake, so I was actually hoping I wouldn't be a fan. But most of the usual things that annoy me about Drakes just aren't really an issue here. I know I didn't really touch on aesthetics here, but the Cutty also has a mean looking profile from most angles. It also looks believable as something humans would build several hundred years in the future, yet futuristic enough to fit into the Star Citizen universe. More importantly, however, this ship is almost the perfect confirmation for long-term daily driver. In my opinion, it's only missing one thing, a kitchen. But I think it more than makes up for that with the fact that it's host to 2 medical beds and it really doesn't sacrifice anything else. It's decent in fight, it flies well, it has okay-ish quantum range, it has a cargo grid, albeit a pretty small one, but it's still sufficient enough to carry around some boxes for loot or whatever. And it has a logout bed. Other than large ships and above, i.e. the Carrack, for the time being, this is the only ship that offers a medbed and a logout bed, so it's actually feasible for long-term use without ever visiting a station or city. So for the people that crave that long-duration adventure-type playthroughs, this ship checks almost every box you could think of. Which puts me in a difficult spot because I only bought this ship for a review, meaning I have to melt it to refill my ship fund for future ship reviews, and I'll be honest, I really don't want to. The Cutlass Red is just one of those ships that I kinda just want to keep around for an indefinite amount of time. But I think I'll end this review here. And now that you know my opinion on the Cutlass Red, drop a comment and tell me yours. I'd love to hear from you. Please do also remember to hit the like and subscribe button if you appreciate this video. We're steadily growing and really appreciate all the love and support the community has shown us so far. So, feel free to join my Discord and Orc. The link is in the description below the video. All I ask is that you're amicable towards the community that we've thus far built. Just a heads up, I announced that I would be live streaming every Friday for the foreseeable future, but after seeing how the servers performed during peak hours, I think I'll be changing that. Keep an eye out for my new schedule in the coming days. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the verse.